The desert sun hammered down on Ezra Stone Hawkins' ranch like the fist of an angry god, turning the earth to dust and the air to fire. At 36, Ezra had learned to read the land's moods, the way other men read newspapers, and this August afternoon in 1882 spoke of nothing but drought and desolation. He worked the fence line near Willow Creek, though calling it a creek these days was an act of pure optimism. The water had dwindled to a trickle that wouldn't satisfy a dying man's thirst. The weathered boards beneath his hands told their own story of seasons endured and storms survived. Each crack and splinter marked time's passage across this harsh country between Fort Defiance and Nowhere Particular. Ezra paused to wipe sweat from his brow, squinting against the glare that turned the horizon into a shimmering curtain of heat. That's when he saw her. At first she was just a dark speck wavering in the distance, small enough to be a trick of the light. But as Ezra watched, the speck moved with purpose, or what passed for purpose when every step was a struggle against exhaustion. He set down his hammer and shaded his eyes, tracking the figure's unsteady progress toward his property line. A child. Couldn't be more than 9 or 10 summers, walking like a broken-winged bird across the scorched earth. Even from 200 yards, Ezra could see how wrong the picture was, the way her traditional Apache dress hung torn and dusty, the way hunger had carved hollows in what should have been round cheeks. Each step seemed to cost her more than she had to give. Most ranchers in the Arizona Territory would have reached for iron first and asked questions later, if at all. The Apache wars had left scars on both sides deeper than any canyon, and trust was a commodity rarer than water in drought season. Ezra's neighbors certainly subscribed to that philosophy. Shoot first, bury the consequences later. The smart thing, the safe thing would be to mount up and ride the other direction until the child became someone else's problem or no problem at all. But Ezra Stone Hawkins had buried his capacity for turning away from suffering in a pine box 3 years ago, alongside his wife Mary and their boy Thomas. Cholera had taken them while he was driving cattle to Tucson, left him with nothing but empty rooms and the kind of silence that drives men to madness or redemption. He'd chosen neither, settling instead for a gray existence between the two, where each day was just another fence to mend another meal, to eat alone. The child stumbled, caught herself, stumbled again. This time she went down hard, raising a small cloud of dust that hung in the still air like a prayer for rain. She didn't get up. Ezra moved without conscious decision, his boots carrying him across the hard-packed earth with long strides. As he drew closer, details emerged that made his chest tighten with an old, familiar ache. The girl's hair, black as crow feathers, was matted with dirt, and something darker blood, maybe dried to rust in the heat. Her dress, once decorated with intricate beadwork, hung in tatters, but it was her face that stopped him. Cold skin stretched too tight over bird-hollow bones, lips cracked like old leather eyes closed against a sun that had become her enemy. He knelt beside her, careful to move slow and deliberate. Even unconscious, even dying, maybe she was Apache, and that meant she'd been raised to fear white men the way rabbits fear hawks. His shadow fell across her face, providing the first mercy she'd likely known in days. "Easy now, little one," Ezra murmured, though he doubted she could hear. His voice came out rusty from disuse. When a man lives alone, he tends to forget the sound of his own words. "Let's see what kind of trouble you found yourself in." Up close, the extent of her condition became heartbreakingly clear. This wasn't just exhaustion or simple hunger. This was starvation, the killing kind that turned children into old souls before their time. Her breathing came shallow and ragged, each inhale a victory against odds that were getting longer by the minute. Ezra's hands hesitated over her small form. Touching her meant involvement, meant choosing sides in a conflict that had been raging since before she was born. meant potentially bringing down the kind of trouble that ended with buildings burned and bodies buried. His neighbors would call him 7 kinds of fool. The Apache would likely call him worse. The girl's eyes fluttered open just for a moment. Dark as desert midnight, they fixed on his face with a mixture of terror and desperate hope that cut through his hesitation like a sharp blade through soft leather. She tried to speak, but all that emerged was a croak drier than the creek bed. Her small hand moved weakly toward her mouth, then fell back to the dust. The message was universal. Water, food, help. In that moment, Ezra saw not an Apache child, but simply a child. Saw his Thomas in those hollow cheeks, his Mary in that fevered brow. The mathematics of survival in the territory said, leave her, but the arithmetic of his heart came up with a different sum entirely. Without another thought, he gathered her into his arms. She weighed no more than a shadow, all sharp bones and fevered skin beneath the tattered dress. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel the rabbit-quick flutter of her pulse against his chest. Too fast, too weak. As he turned toward his cabin, cradling her with the same care he'd once shown his own boy, something caught his eye. Around her neck, partially hidden by her torn collar, hung a necklace of such distinctive craftsmanship that his blood ran cold. The beadwork pattern, the sacred symbols worked in turquoise and shell. He'd seen its like only once before, when old Ben Crenshaw had returned from a trading expedition with tales of meeting the great Apache chief Red Sky. This wasn't just any child. This was the daughter of the most powerful Apache leader in 3 territories, a man whose name alone could mobilize 200 warriors with a single word. A man who had sworn vengeance on any white who harmed his people. Ezra stood there in the burning sun, holding a dying child who might well be his own death sentence, and made the only choice his conscience would allow. He quickened his pace toward the cabin, her small body burning with fever against his chest. Behind them, the desert watched with 1,000 eyes, and somewhere beyond the shimmering horizon, forces were already in motion that would bring 200 Apache warriors to his door. But that was tomorrow's trouble. Today there was only a child who needed water, food, and whatever mercy a broken man could provide. Ezra kicked open his cabin door and stepped inside, carrying his burden into the cool darkness. Outside, the desert waited, patient as death and twice as certain. The child stirred slightly as he laid her on his only good chair, the one Mary had brought from St. Louis as part of her dowry. Her eyes opened again, focusing on his face with an intensity that seemed impossible given her condition. She spoke then a rapid stream of Apache words that Ezra couldn't understand, but whose meaning was clear enough. She was asking for help, or perhaps asking who he was, or maybe warning him of dangers he couldn't yet imagine. "Rest now," he said softly, moving to the stove where last night's stew still simmered. "We'll sort out the talking once you've got some food in your belly." As he ladled the stew into a bowl, Ezra caught himself wondering what name her people called her, what dreams filled her sleep when sleep came peaceful instead of desperate. Wondered, too, what series of catastrophes had driven a chief's daughter to seek water at a white man's ranch alone and dying in the desert that should have been her birthright and sanctuary. The answers would come, he supposed, or they wouldn't. Either way, he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The child was under his roof now, and that made her his responsibility, whatever the cost. The smell of beef stew seemed to revive the girl like spring rain on withered plants. Her nostrils flared and her eyes tracked Ezra's movement as he brought the bowl to her. He could see the war between dignity and desperate hunger playing out across her young features. Pride was a luxury starvation didn't allow. "Slow now," Ezra cautioned, though he knew she couldn't understand his words. He demonstrated by taking an imaginary small sip from the air. "Too fast and you'll sick it all back up." She reached for the bowl with hands that trembled like autumn leaves. but Ezra kept hold of it, spooning small portions to her lips instead. The first taste brought tears to her eyes, whether from relief or the simple pleasure of food, he couldn't say. She ate with the focused intensity of someone who'd learned that meals were never guaranteed. Between spoonfuls, Ezra studied her more closely. Beneath the dirt and exhaustion, she had the fine-boned features that marked her as high-born among her people. The beadwork on her dress, despite its sad condition, showed craftsmanship beyond the ordinary. This was a child accustomed to privilege, which made her current state all the more troubling. "Morning dove." The words came soft as whisper between bites, and it took Ezra a moment to realize she'd spoken in English. "That your name?" he asked, pausing with the spoon halfway to her lips. She nodded, then pointed to herself. "Morning dove." Then she pointed to him, the question clear in her raised eyebrows. "Ezra," he said. "Ezra Hawkins." She tried to repeat it, but it came out more like Ezra Hawkin. Close enough. The ghost of a smile played at the corners of her cracked lips, the first sign of anything beyond survival he'd seen from her. The afternoon sun slanted through the cabin's single window, painting golden bars across the rough wooden floor. Outside, Ezra's few cattle lowed in the distance, their voices carrying on the still air. It was the kind of peaceful moment that made a man forget the world beyond his fence lines, which is why the sound of approaching horses hit like a bucket of cold water to the face. Ezra moved to the window, keeping low. 3 riders approached from the direction of town, their horses kicking up dust clouds that hung in the air like smoke signals. Even at a distance, he recognized them: Josiah Brennan, his nearest neighbor and a man who'd never met an Apache he didn't want to shoot. Deputy Samuel Crenshaw, whose father had lost a brother to raiders back in '71, and Reverend Matthias Cole, who preached on Sundays about loving thy neighbor but seemed to have very specific ideas about which neighbors qualified. "Company coming," Ezra muttered, more to himself than to Morning Dove. She must have heard something in his tone, though, because she shrank back in the chair, trying to make herself smaller. Ezra stepped out onto the porch before they could dismount, his rifle conspicuously absent, but his stance making it clear they weren't to come closer without invitation. "Josiah, Deputy, Reverend," he nodded to each in turn. "Hot day for a social call." Josiah Brennan swung down from his saddle with the bow-legged grace of a man who'd spent more years on horseback than on foot. His face was red as a sunset, whether from ride or temper Ezra couldn't say. "Cut the pleasantries, Hawkins," Josiah spat. "Ben Crenshaw saw smoke signals from the Dragoon Mountains this morning. Apache signals. They're looking for something." "Or someone," Deputy Crenshaw added, studying Ezra's face with the practiced eye of a lawman. "Word from Fort Bowie is that Red Sky's daughter went missing 3 days back. Wandered off during a buffalo hunt, they say. Storm came through and she never made it back to camp." Ezra kept his expression neutral, though his mind raced. 3 days in the desert. It was a miracle Morning Dove had made it this far. "That's unfortunate," he said carefully, "but I fail to see what it has to do with me." "Don't play dense," Josiah snapped. "If that girl turns up dead on white land, Red Sky won't care about the circumstances. He'll paint the whole territory red with blood." Reverend Cole, who'd remained mounted, finally spoke up. "What Josiah is trying to say, in his colorful way, is that we're concerned for everyone's safety. If you've seen anything unusual, any sign of Apache movement, it would be best to share that information." The weight of their expectation pressed down on Ezra like a physical thing. These were his neighbors' men he'd shared drinks and stories with. Men who'd helped him bury Mary and Thomas when the cholera took them. They deserved truth, but truth would sign Morning Dove's death warrant. "Haven't seen anything but dust and dying cattle. Ezra said the lie, sliding out smooth as aged whiskey. If Apache are riding, they haven't come this way. Deputy Crenshaw leaned forward in his saddle eyes narrowing. You sure about that, Ezra? Because if you're hiding something and it brings trouble down on the rest of us. I said I haven't seen anything. Ezra let steel creep into his voice. Now, unless you boys want to help me mend fence line, I've got work to do. Josiah looked ready to push the issue, but Reverend Cole raised a hand. We should go. But Ezra, if anything changes, if you see or hear anything, you'll let us know. Of course, Ezra lied again, watching as they mounted up and rode off Josiah, shooting suspicious glances back over his shoulder. He waited until they were dust specks on the horizon before returning inside. Mourning Dove had pressed herself into the corner of the chair, knees drawn up to her chest, making herself as small as possible. The empty stew bowl sat forgotten on the floor beside her. They're gone, Ezra said softly. You're safe. She looked at him with those dark eyes, and he could see she understood more than just his words. She'd heard the tension in the voices outside, recognized the danger that surrounded her, even in this shelter. My father, she said in careful English, he will come. It wasn't a question or a plea. It was a statement of fact delivered with the certainty of one who'd grown up knowing her father's power. I expect he will, Ezra agreed, settling into the opposite chair. Question is what happens when he gets here. Mourning Dove was quiet for a long moment, then spoke in a mixture of English and Apache, with gestures filling the gaps where words failed. From what Ezra could piece together, she'd indeed wandered off during a hunt, following what she thought was a deer trail. The storm had come sudden and fierce, the kind that could turn dry washes into raging torrents in minutes. She'd sought shelter but became turned around in the darkness and rain. 3 sons, she said, holding up 3 fingers. No water, no food, thought I would join the spirits. But you didn't, Ezra said. You made it here. She nodded solemnly. The spirits guided me, said I would find. She searched for the word, then pointed to him. Friend. Friend. Such a simple word to bridge such a vast divide. Ezra thought of all the reasons they couldn't be friends. The wars, the raids, the blood spilled on both sides until the desert itself seemed stained with it. Then he looked at this child, brave enough to trust him, despite everything her people had taught her about his kind, and decided maybe the reasons didn't matter as much as the choice. Friend, he agreed, and was rewarded with a smile that transformed her wan face. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. Ezra tended to Mourning Dove's minor wounds, scratches from cacti and rock splinters from walking too far in thin moccasins. She submitted to his ministrations with a dignity beyond her years, only wincing when he cleaned the deepest cuts with whiskey from his private stock. As evening approached, she grew restless, moving to the window to peer out at the darkening sky. They search, she said. All warriors search for Red Sky's daughter. How many warriors? Ezra asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. She held up both hands, opening and closing them multiple times. Ezra counted along 20, 40, 60. She kept going until she'd indicated 200. 200 warriors, he said, his mouth suddenly dry. That's a lot of men to find one girl. I am... She searched for words, then touched the beaded necklace at her throat. Important. Last daughter, only daughter now. Sadness crept into her voice. Sisters gone to spirit world. Sickness took them. Ezra understood then. She wasn't just Red Sky's daughter. She was his only surviving child, the future of his bloodline. Her death would demand a blood price that would drench the territory in violence. As if summoned by his thoughts, a sound drifted across the desert drums, distant but distinct, their rhythm steady as a heartbeat. Mourning Dove straightened her face, lighting up with recognition even as fear crept into her eyes. "They come," she whispered. "My father comes." Ezra moved to the window, peering out into the gathering darkness. At first he saw nothing, then, like ghosts materializing from the very air, shapes appeared on the horizon. Warriors on horseback moving in perfect formation, their approach as inevitable as tomorrow's sunrise. Even in the dying light he could see the weapons they carried, the war paint that marked their faces. "Mourning Dove," he said urgently, "when they get here, what will happen? Will they listen if you tell them I helped you?" She bit her lip, uncertainty clear on her young face. "Father very angry, very scared for me. Sometimes when scared, fathers don't listen good." That was what Ezra had feared. Red Sky might be too consumed with fury to hear explanations, too ready to assume the worst. And why shouldn't he? History gave him every reason to believe a white man with his daughter meant nothing but harm. The drums grew louder, joined now by the sound of hundreds of hooves striking earth. Ezra could make out individual riders, now their formation tightening as they approached his ranch. This wasn't a search party anymore. This was a war party come to claim what was theirs and exact vengeance for any harm done. "Listen to me," Ezra said, kneeling before Mourning Dove. "Whatever happens, you tell them the truth. Tell them I found you, fed you, helped you. Can you do that?" She nodded, but tears had begun to streak down her cheeks. "I tell them, but Ezra?" She reached out and touched his face with one small hand. Sometimes truth, not enough. Sometimes blood speaks louder. The sound of horses had stopped. In the sudden silence, Ezra could hear his own heartbeat, loud as those war drums. They were here, 200 Apache warriors led by a father whose love for his daughter was matched only by his hatred for those who'd harmed his people. Ezra stood slowly checking the loads in his rifle, more from habit than any belief it would help. 6 shots against 200 warriors might as well try to stop a river with his bare hands. "Stay inside until I call for you," he told Mourning Dove. "Let me talk to them first." But even as he reached for the door handle, he knew talking might not be enough. The next few minutes would determine whether the sun rose on peace or on a massacre that would echo through the territory for generations. The door opened with a creak that sounded like the gates of judgment itself. The sight that greeted Ezra when he stepped onto his porch was something from the deepest nightmares of every white settler in the territory. 200 Apache warriors sat their horses in perfect silence, forming a semicircle that enclosed his entire homestead. The dying light caught on lance points and rifle barrels, turning them to spears of fire. War paint transformed familiar human features into masks of judgment, and every weapon was trained on him with deadly precision. At the center of the formation sat a man who could only be Red Sky himself. Even mounted, his presence dominated the gathering like a mountain dominates a plain. Age had touched him with silver at the temples, but his back remained straight as a lodgepole pine, his hands steady on his horse's reins. The chief's face was carved from stone, and old pain, his eyes burning with the kind of fury that preceded massacre. For a long moment that stretched like a century, no one moved. No one spoke. The desert itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which way the blood would flow. Then Red Sky dismounted with fluid grace, his movements deliberate, and waited with menace. When he spoke, his English was precise, each word placed like a knife thrust. "White man, you have something that belongs to me." Ezra's throat felt full of sand, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "Chief Red Sky, your daughter is safe. She's inside, resting." A ripple passed through the warrior's hands, tightening on weapons. Red Sky's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "You admit you have taken her?" "I admit I found her," Ezra said carefully. 3 hours ago, dying of thirst near my fence line. I brought her inside, gave her food and water. She's safe and unharmed." The word of a white man, Red Sky said, and his tone made it clear what value he placed on such things. "Worth less than dust. Bring her out, now." Ezra half turned toward the door, then paused. "She's weak. The desert nearly killed her, but I'll bring her out." He raised his voice slightly. "Mourning Dove, your father is here." The door opened slowly, and Mourning Dove emerged. The sight of her alive, walking on her own power, sent another ripple through the assembled warriors. She moved carefully but steadily to the edge of the porch, her dark eyes finding her father's face. "Father," she said in Apache, then switched to English for Ezra's benefit. "This man saved me. I was dying. He gave me life." Red Sky's composure cracked for just a moment, relief flashing across his features before the stone mask reasserted itself. He spoke to her in rapid Apache questions, tumbling over each other. She answered just as quickly, gesturing toward Ezra, toward the cabin, miming eating and drinking. But as she spoke, one of the warriors behind Red Sky suddenly dismounted. He was younger than the chief, perhaps 30 summers, with scars that spoke of battles survived and enemies defeated. His face contorted with rage as he pushed forward. "Lies!" he shouted in accented English. "The white man lies, and now he makes the child lie too?" He turned to address the other warriors, switching to Apache, his voice rising with each word. Ezra didn't need translation to understand this man was calling for blood. Red Sky held up a hand for silence, but the warrior wasn't finished. He pointed his lance at Ezra, then spoke directly to the chief. Whatever he said made several other warriors mutter agreement. "Thunder Walker says you have bewitched my daughter." Red Sky translated his tone, giving away nothing of his own thoughts. "He says white men killed his brother at Sibique Creek. Says all whites are liars and killers. Says the only way to know truth is to see if you will die for it." Mourning Dove started to protest, but Red Sky silenced her with a gesture. His attention remained fixed on Ezra, studying him like a hunter studying prey. "He challenges your words," Red Sky continued. "Says if you truly saved my daughter from kindness, not for trade or worse purpose, you will prove it. Face him in combat. If you win, we leave in peace. If you die..." He didn't need to finish. "Father, no," Mourning Dove cried out, but Thunder Walker had already moved into the open space before the porch lance at the ready. Ezra looked at the warrior, younger, faster, trained from birth for combat, then at the assembled host waiting for blood. He thought of Mary and Thomas waiting for him on the other side. It would be easy to die here, to let Thunder Walker's lance find his heart and end 3 years of grinding loneliness. But then he looked at Mourning Dove, tears streaming down her face, and saw not just Red Sky's daughter, but every child who deserved a chance at peace between their peoples. Saw a future where Apache and white might share water instead of spilling blood. "I accept," Ezra said quietly. The warriors formed a circle, their horses creating an arena from which there would be no escape. Thunder Walker waited in the center, his lance spinning in casual display of skill. Ezra descended from the porch, his rifle left behind. This would be knife work, close and brutal. As he entered the circle, Red Sky spoke again. "Thunder Walker says you may choose weapons, lance, knife, or hands." "Knife," Ezra replied. He'd carried one since the war, knew its weight and balance like his own heartbeat. Thunder Walker smiled, the expression all teeth and no warmth. He tossed his lance aside and drew a blade that caught the last light like a sliver of sunset. They circled each other, two predators measuring distance and weakness. Thunder Walker struck first, his blade whistling through air where Ezra's throat had been a heartbeat before. The Apache warrior was fast, desert lightning fast, and Ezra found himself giving ground immediately. Another strike, another narrow dodge. Blood appeared on Ezra's arm where the blade had kissed skin. The watching warriors remained silent, but Ezra could feel their anticipation. They expected to see white blood spilled in the dust payment for 1,000 grievances. Thunderwalker pressed his advantage, driving Ezra back toward the edge of the circle, where escape meant death from 200 arrows. But Ezra had learned knife fighting in places where the only rule was survival. As Thunderwalker committed to another thrust, confident in his superiority, Ezra pivoted inside the arc of the blade. His elbow caught the warrior's wrist, sending the knife spinning away. In the same motion, Ezra's own blade found Thunderwalker's throat, stopping just as the edge touched skin. For a moment they stood, frozen, Ezra's knife at Thunderwalker's throat, the warrior's eyes wide with shock. Ezra could end it, here could take the life that had been offered. The silence stretched until it seemed the whole desert waited for his decision. Then Ezra stepped back, lowering his knife. "I didn't save Mourning Dove to spill Apache blood," he said loud enough for all to hear. "Her life is worth more than anyone's death." Thunderwalker stood motionless, hand moving slowly to his throat, where a thin line of blood marked where the blade had rested. The defeat in his eyes warred with something else, confusion perhaps, or the first stirring of respect. Before anyone could speak, Mourning Dove broke from her father's side and ran into the circle, but instead of going to Ezra, she stopped before Thunderwalker and began speaking in passionate Apache. Her young voice carried across the gathering, and Ezra watched faces change as she spoke, suspicion giving way to uncertainty, anger cooling to contemplation. Red Sky, translated in a low voice, meant only for Ezra. She tells Thunderwalker that holding to old hatred makes us no better than those who hurt us first. She asks if he has children, asks what he would want a stranger to do if his child lay dying in the desert. She says, Red Sky paused, something like wonder creeping into his tone. She says the spirits led her to you because they are tired of blood, that perhaps it is time to learn a new way. Thunderwalker's response when it came was barely above a whisper. He spoke directly to Mourning Dove, then turned to face Ezra. When he spoke in English, his words came slowly but clearly. "You could have killed me. By rights, my life is yours. Instead, you give it back." He touched the small cut on his throat. "I have never known white man to do this. Perhaps the child speaks truth. Perhaps spirits do grow tired of blood." The admission seemed to break something in the gathering. Warriors began to murmur among themselves, the tight formation loosening as men leaned together to share words. Red Sky watched it all with the calculating gaze of a leader reading the mood of his people. Finally, the chief raised his hand for silence. "Ezra Hawkins," he said, using Ezra's name for the first time. "My daughter lives because of you. Thunderwalker lives because of you. These are debts that cannot be ignored." He gestured, and an elderly warrior dismounted and came forward. His hair was white as winter snow, his face lined with decades of sun and struggle. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of years beyond counting. Red Sky, translated, Elder Grey Wolf says the spirits have sent us a test this night. Not test of war strength, but test of wisdom. Can we see kindness when it comes from unexpected places? Can we choose new paths when old ones lead only to more graves? The elder studied Ezra with eyes that seemed to see through skin to soul. He asked a question in Apache, which Red Sky translated. He asks if you would risk your life again to save Apache child, knowing cost. Truth now. Ezra didn't hesitate. Yes, even knowing it might bring war to your door. A child is a child, Ezra said simply. Apache or white, they deserve a chance to grow up, to maybe build a better world than the one we've made. Grey Wolf nodded slowly, then spoke at length to the assembled warriors. His words carried the weight of prophecy, and even Ezra, understanding nothing of the language, could feel their power. When he finished, the silence that followed was different, thoughtful rather than threatening. Red Sky dismounted and approached Ezra directly. Up close, the chief was even more imposing, but the fury had left his eyes, replaced by something more complex. "Grey Wolf says you will be marked as friend to our people," Red Sky said. "Any Apache who harms you or yours will answer to council, but there is condition." "Name it," Ezra said. "If Apache come to your door, hungry, hurt, hunted, you help them as you helped my daughter. You become bridge between our peoples. You accept this." Ezra thought of his empty house, his lonely meals, his purposeless days. Then he looked at Morning Dove, who watched him with hope bright in her eyes despite everything she'd endured. "I accept," he said. What happened next surprised everyone, perhaps Red Sky most of all. The chief extended his hand in the white man's fashion, and Ezra took it. The grip was firm, calloused from years of holding reins and weapons, but it was also the grip of agreement, of possibility. "We go now," Red Sky said, releasing Ezra's hand. "But this is not ending, is beginning." As the warriors prepared to leave, Morning Dove ran to Ezra one last time. She hugged him around the waist, her small arms barely reaching, and spoke in her improving English. "Thank you, Ezra Hawken. You save me, I save you. Now we save others." "Yes, yes," Ezra agreed, his voice rough with emotion. He'd thought long dead. "Now we save others." The Apache left as they'd come, melting into the desert darkness, like smoke dissolving in wind. But the drum beats that accompanied their departure were different now, not war rhythms, but something else. Something that might, with time and patience and courage, become the heartbeat of peace. Ezra stood on his porch long after they'd gone, watching stars emerge in the clear desert sky. His ranch was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, not the silence of isolation, but the pause before something new begins. The seasons turned as they always had in the high desert, but for Ezra Stone Hawkins, each change brought new purpose to days that had once blurred together in lonely sameness. Word of the night when 200 Apache warriors chose peace over vengeance spread through the territory like wildfire, growing in the telling, until some versions had Ezra fighting 50 warriors bare-handed, while others claimed Morning Dove had called down spirits to protect him. The truth, as Ezra knew, was both simpler and more profound. Two peoples who had every reason to hate each other had chosen a different path, and that choice rippled outward like stones thrown in still water. The first test came 3 weeks after that night, when an Apache boy appeared at Ezra's gate. No more than 12 summers, he clutched a festering wound on his leg where a white settler's trap had caught him. The boy's eyes held the same wary desperation Ezra had seen in Morning Dove's, but also a flicker of hope. Ezra brought him inside, cleaned the wound with the same whiskey that had served for Morning Dove's scratches, and sent him on his way with food and clean bandages. The boy spoke no English, but his message was clear in the way he clasped Ezra's hand before leaving. The bridge was real, and it would hold weight. Winter came early that year, bringing snow that turned the desert into an alien landscape of white silence. On the coldest night, when wind howled like grieving spirits, Ezra heard horses approach. He opened his door to find Deputy Samuel Crenshaw supporting a wounded Apache warrior, both men half frozen and near collapse. "Found him out by Skeleton Canyon," Crenshaw gasped through chattering teeth. "Horse threw him. Would have left him, but I remembered what you did. Figured if you could choose different, maybe I could too." They spent the night keeping the warrior alive, white lawman and white rancher, working together to save an Apache life. When morning came and the warrior could ride, he spoke a single word, in English, "brother," before disappearing into the white expanse. Spring brought Morning Dove back to Ezra's ranch, but this time she came openly, riding beside her father, with a small group of Apache women and children. She had grown in the months between taller and more assured, but her smile remained bright as desert stars. "We bring gift," she announced in much improved English, gesturing as the women unloaded beautifully woven blankets and baskets. "For Bridgekeeper." But the real gift was the afternoon that followed. Apache children played in Ezra's yard while their mothers traded stories and skills with the white women who had cautiously come to see this unprecedented gathering. Reverend Cole, who had ridden out expecting trouble, found himself deep in theological discussion with an Apache elder who, it turned out, had questions about the white man's God that challenged and delighted the minister in equal measure. "Fear makes us small," Morning Dove told Ezra as they watched children of both cultures chase each other in games that needed no translation. "But choosing trust makes us large, like sky." Summer blazed across the territory, and with it came trouble. A group of young white miners, drunk on whiskey and old prejudices, had attacked an Apache family traveling to trade. 2 were dead, including a child, and Red Sky's warriors gathered in the mountains, war drums echoing across the canyons. Ezra rode out alone, finding the war camp after 2 days of hard travel. The warriors who met him had painted for battle, their faces masked in designs that promised retribution, but they knew him now, knew his name and meaning, and so they brought him to Red Sky's fire instead of leaving his scalp for the ravens. "They killed my people," Red Sky said without preamble. "A child Hawkins, same age as Morning Dove when you found her. The miners must pay in blood or my warriors will not be held back." "Let me talk to the sheriff," Ezra urged. "Let white man's law handle white man's crime. If justice isn't done, then consider your options. But give law a chance first." Red Sky's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "White man's law has never brought justice for Apache dead." "Things are changing," Ezra insisted. "Slowly, yes, but changing. Deputy Crenshaw saved one of your warriors last winter. Reverend Cole preaches cooperation from his pulpit. Give them a chance to prove change is real." The debate raged through the night with Thunderwalker, now one of Ezra's unexpected advocates, arguing for patience while younger warriors demanded immediate vengeance. Finally, as dawn painted the mountains, Crimson Red Sky made his decision. 7 days, he said. "You have 7 days to show that white man's justice exists for Apache deaths. If miners do not hang for their crimes, we paint for war." Ezra rode back harder than he'd come, his horse lathered and exhausted, when he reached the sheriff's office in Tombstone. What followed was the kind of legal drama that would be remembered in territorial history: a white rancher demanding justice for Apache deaths, a sheriff caught between duty and prejudice, and a town divided between old hatred and new possibility. The trial lasted 3 days. Ezra testified about the bridge being built between peoples, about children playing together, and wounded warriors being saved. Morning Dove came speaking with eloquence that moved even hardened hearts, asking how peace could grow if justice was denied. On the 4th day, the jury returned its verdict guilty of murder. The miners would hang. The execution took place on the 7th day, with Apache warriors watching from the hills to see if white man's justice was more than words. When the trapdoors fell and rough justice was done, Red Sky himself appeared at the edge of town. "The bridge holds," he said simply to Ezra. "We remember." Years flowed by like water in the desert, sometimes flooding, sometimes barely a trickle, but always moving forward. Ezra's ranch became neutral ground where Apache and white could meet, trade, and slowly learn that their enemies had names, families, fears, and hopes not so different from their own. Morning Dove grew into a young woman of remarkable gifts, her fluency in both languages making her an invaluable translator and peacekeeper. She would arrive at Ezra's ranch with disputes to settle, contracts to negotiate, misunderstandings to untangle. More often than not, she came simply to share a meal with the man she called her white father, bringing news of her people and carrying back stories of his. On Ezra's 50th birthday, a celebration occurred that would have been unthinkable years before. Apache and White gathered at his ranch for a feast that lasted 2 days. Thunderwalker, now a chief in his own right after Red Sky's peaceful death, brought his children to meet the man who had spared his life. Deputy Crenshaw, now Sheriff Crenshaw, shared whiskey with Apache warriors he'd once hunted. Reverend Cole offered prayers that blended Christian words with Apache blessings, creating something new and hopeful. "You did this," Morning Dove told Ezra as they watched the unprecedented gathering. "You chose kindness when choosing hate would have been easier." "You did this," Ezra corrected, "a scared little girl who trusted a stranger. You changed everything that night." She smiled, and in that moment Ezra saw not the dying child he'd found by his fence, but the bridge between worlds she'd become. "We did this," she said finally, "together." When Ezra Stone Hawkins died peacefully in his sleep at 73, his funeral became legend. Apache and White stood side by side as they laid him to rest on a hill overlooking his ranch. Morning Dove, now a grandmother herself, spoke the eulogy in both languages, telling the story of a man who chose compassion over safety, understanding over fear. "He was not perfect," she said, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "He was just a man who made a choice. But that choice created ripples that became waves, that became a new current in the river of our history. When we tell our children why Apache and White can share water in peace, we will tell them about Ezra Hawkins, who saw not an enemy's child, but simply a child. Thunderwalker's son trained in the white man's medicine, and the Apache healing ways would establish a clinic on Ezra's old ranch. Morning Dove's daughter would become the territory's first Apache woman, admitted to the bar, arguing cases that protected both people's rights. The bridge Ezra built with one act of kindness became a road, then a highway, carrying commerce and culture and hope between communities that had once known only conflict. But perhaps the truest measure of Ezra's legacy came in the small moments: an Apache child sharing lunch with a white schoolmate, a white rancher helping an Apache neighbor bring in his harvest. Former enemies become partners in building something better than either could create alone. The desert remembers everything, every drop of blood spilled, every tear shed, every act of cruelty or kindness. And in the high country between Fort Defiance and the Dragoon Mountains, it remembers the night when 200 warriors came for vengeance and left with hope, when a lonely rancher found purpose in compassion, when a little girl's trust in a stranger changed the course of history. Some bridges are built with stone and timber. Others are built with harder materials: forgiveness, understanding, and the radical belief that people can choose to be better than their past. Ezra Stone Hawkins and Morning Dove built such a bridge, and it stands still, carrying all who have courage enough to cross it toward a horizon bright with possibility.